Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture 44 of week 9. This is Dripta and the topic of today's lecture is language, dialect and standardization. So, today we will be talking about the definition of dialect and the idea of dialect. We will also try to see the differences between language and dialect. Then we will talk about the idea of accommodation. Then we will talk about the idea of regional and social dialect. Finally, I will introduce you to the idea of social stratification and dialects. So, I am sure the idea of a dialect is there in our mind in different ways. So, now it is our call to have an understanding of this term from a socio-linguistic point of view, and there are a lot of complexities and lot of misconceptions which are associated with this idea of dialect. So, if we ask this question, what is the role of a dialect? You can talk about the points that I have listed. Dialects show a speaker's regional origin, or you can say regional identity. So, if you listen to certain dialect, you can figure out that this person belongs to this particular geographical area. So, it is the regional origin, but there can be more than one dialects in one region. It is not that when you are saying regional origin, there is a possibility of having only one dialect in one region. No, it is not the case always. There can be more than one dialects in one region. And apart from the regional origin, dialects also show a speaker's social position. So, regional origin and social position both are important, and we will see how. Again, we are coming to the point of choice that we are using again and again in the last few lectures. You can say dialects can be chosen. So, it is of course dependent on the speaker. The speaker can actually choose a dialect while using. And there is also another important factor here: speakers adjust their speech behavior in specific social contexts. So, if you can't understand why I am talking about this adjustment, then we will be talking more about it in today's class itself. You can say that a language L is conceived as consisting of an assemblage of dialects D1 to Dn. So, why are we saying that it is an assemblage of dialects? So, now the idea is that when we are talking about the idea of a language, it is basically a combination of different dialects. Together we are referring to this idea as a language. And how dialects are related to each other, we discuss these issues in the domains of dialectology or dialect geography. It is a very distinct domain which has a number of important points which are being done in contemporary research. Now, let us look at this very simple diagram. So, there is language L and 3 dialects D1, D2 and D3, which are a part of language L. We already saw that, we already talked about the fact that language can be considered as an assemblage of different dialects. So, dialect 1, 2 and 3 are part of language L. But there is a problem with the second diagram, language A and language B. You can say D1 is a part of LA, D3 is a part of LB, but there is a problem with the status of D2. So, people who speak language A and people who speak language B, both of them claim that D2 is a dialect of their language. So, maybe there are certain examples which are popping up in your mind. So, please remember those examples because it is important for our purpose. There are certain traditional definitions of dialect that some of us know. For example, size of the dialects, you can say that a language is big and dialect is small, and there is another criteria for classifying dialects which is popularly known as mutual intelligibility. If speaker of A and speaker of B can understand each other, if they are mutually intelligible, then they speak different dialects of a same language, and if they do not understand each other, they speak different language. So, this is an older definition, but now there are challenges against it, and of course, we can see that there are certain problems. So, if you consider the dialects of Chinese, for example, you can say Mandarin, Wu, Min, Yu and Hakka. These are all attested dialects of Chinese, but these are not mutually intelligible. So, are we saying that no, they do not belong to a single language, but they belong to a single language Chinese? So, then how do we deal with this criteria of classification? We can also think about an example in terms of German-Dutch border in European context. It is difficult to figure out if a variety is a dialect of German or Dutch, just like the diagram that you have seen. Language A and language B both are claiming that dialect 2 belongs to them. So, what is happening to the German-Dutch border is a similar case. If you think about Indian context, we say that there is something called dialect chain. In fact, the German-Dutch example can also be referred to as a dialect chain. What is a dialect chain? So, if you consider the northern part of Indian subcontinent around 2000 kilometers, say from Bengal to Punjab, there is no clear cut dialect boundaries. And if you think about Germanic dialect chain, 3 languages are distinguished, for example, German, Dutch and Luxembourgish. These are attested as different languages, but there is some kind of a continuum. So, this is a problem for dialectologists, and this is also a problem for sociolinguists as a whole. So, the speakers can perceive them as different languages. If we talk about German, Dutch, Luxembourgish, or if we talk about the continuum, which is basically a 2000 kilometers continuum in India, there are people who consider themselves as speakers of different languages, not dialects. So, what is happening? So, there is a continuum. We can actually highlight on this point that there is a continuum, and we need to understand what is happening here. We need to understand the process. We are saying at this point a very important point, languages are separated by political rather than linguistic criteria. So, when we are saying that German is a language, Dutch is another language, or in Indian context you can think about any language that comes to your mind if it belongs to the same continuum, but we are attesting them as different languages because of political rather than linguistic criteria. So, there is this overlap of certain concepts in the social sciences with social linguistics, and we will be also discussing this in the next lecture when we will be talking about standardization in a slightly different way. But please pay attention to the last bullet point, which says that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. This is super important for us, because we know that a language is a combination of several dialects, and again we are saying that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So, it is the power issue which is the most important factor for determining the difference between dialect and language. So, a dialect with power like army and navy will be considered as a language. So, the names that we were discussing like German, Dutch, Luxembourgish, all of them have some kind of power, they have some kind of army and navy, which is making them a language, not a dialect. So, Dutch and German are considered as 2 different languages. Why do we consider them as 2 different languages? You know now, because of the power issues, but we should also know that they have codified grammar and dictionaries. So, in the last class we were talking about standard languages, and we also knew that codification is a part of standard language. We will talk more about it, but we are coming to the same point here when we are basically talking about the idea of 2 separate languages. We are saying that this codified form will always have grammar and dictionaries. This is a part of codification process. So, a language is also considered as a dialect with a written norm. So, when you are saying that no, this is not a dialect, this is a language, it can be A, B, C, anything, any example that is coming to your mind, But whenever you are saying that no, it is a dialect, it is a language, please question yourself whether you are considering these 2 points, Army and Navy, power, and written norm, codification. So, we can investigate the ideology behind the written norms in an interdisciplinary manner. So, when we are talking about some kind of ideology which is there behind the written norms, it is not only linguistic, right, it is of course extra linguistic. So, we need to borrow from the idea of power from other disciplines as well. So, we need to take into account all these details. Now, let us talk about this idea of accommodation, which is another important factor in terms of dialect and standard language or dialect and language distinction. So, when people speak, they try to adjust in a social dimension. So, we are talking about adjustment in terms of certain social dimensions. So, this is something like adults using simple vocabulary to explain a complex technical term to a child. So, when we are talking about some kind of adjustment in social dimension, we can say that adjustments can be upwards. For example, a dialect speaker adopting standard pronunciation for a job interview, and also it can be downwards for displaying solidarity with a particular group. So, these 2 points are extremely important for accommodation theory. So, dialect differences are defined on a vertical social axis when we talk about variable prestige and recognition. So, people basically try to get rid of low esteem dialects, and let me tell you, this is associated with negative attitudes that we have discussed earlier, and converge to the standard. So, this convergence is another technical term that we are not explaining here, but you can try to say that they are trying to go towards the standard form. And formal education has a role in this regard. So, how formal education is important, we will talk about it later as well. People have negative attitudes, as I told you, towards certain accents. So, here we are using another technical term, accent, which is a suprasegmental feature, you know by now. So, we are saying that negative attitudes are not only there for the entire non-standard variety, but it is also towards certain accents or the way of speaking. And of course, we can say that it needs to be changed. So, when we are saying that it needs to be changed, we are talking about some kind of counterculture and aesthetics of the oppressed approach. Here is a dialogue from, here is a quote from Wolfram 1997. You can say that the failure to recognize the legitimacy of dialect differences may lead to a kind of discrimination that is as onerous as other types based upon race, ethnicity or class. So, basically we are talking about some kind of discrimination which is very important for us. Now, let us talk about regional variation. When we started talking about dialect, we said that we will talk about both regional and social factors in the discussion of dialects, right. So, what is regional variation? You can think about certain regional names for different objects, right. So, can you give some example from the languages that you know, or you can say that linguistic varieties that you know, if we do not use the term dialect. So, variety is a neutral term instead of using language or dialect or standard language. So, the linguistic varieties that you know, please list a few terms that are basically referring to the same object. So, different regional names for different objects. And if you consider the languages of Europe or India, you will see that the languages are compartmentalized. There is of course an ideology behind it, there is a whole history and social process behind it, but languages of both Europe and India are compartmentalized, but in reality they blend with each other. So, when we technically refer to some languages, we do not refer to the blending, So, the idea of blending is there in your mind. So, we are not talking about blending as a morphological process, but we are talking about blending as a phenomena in terms of sociolinguistics. For example, if you think about two villages and when you are moving from one village to the next village, there is a chain of continuum, the continuum that we have referred to earlier. But what if they belong to two countries in Europe or two provinces in India? So, is it the case that we will label them as dialects of two different languages like language A and B in the diagram? So, this is actually a very complex question, but whenever we are talking about regional variation, we have to understand these complexities. So, I am asking you to think about these two questions at this point. Can you differentiate between a regional dialect and a social dialect? So, what do I mean by social dialect? So, that is the question here. You can understand what a regional dialect is, because I have given some example, but what is a social dialect? Can you also think about some variety where the geographical factors are not important, rather social factors are important? And can you differentiate between regional dialect and regional accent? It is another important point. And at this point, ask yourself the same question again, what is a continuum? Now, we are coming to social variation. Along with regional variation, social variation is an important point for us when we are learning the basics of dialectology. So, RP is something, maybe some of you are familiar with this term, which was promoted by BBC. I am deliberately saying was, because it's BBC is promoting other varieties of English as well in recent days. So, RP was promoted by BBC and it is popularly known as real posh, but it is actually received pronunciation, it is not real posh. So, received pronunciation means something which has prestige, which belongs to the upper class people, and we are talking about a social accent here, which is not a regional one. So, it is important for us to distinguish between these two and understand both in order to understand this idea of dialect as a whole. So, you can say that a stereotypical dialect speaker is an elderly rural person who is unintelligible to a modern city dweller. What does it mean? So, you are basically giving an example of a rural person who is elderly, and there is some incomprehensibility or unintelligibility for a city dweller. It means the person does not use a variety which is so called upper class variety. So, what does it mean? Is there a role of social variation at all? Now, we will also talk about different grammatical patterns. So, I told you that whenever we are doing sociolinguistics, it is not that we will just talk about a relationship between language and society as a whole, but we do need the linguistic evidences. We need some evidences of language structure, where we can see that the variation is reflected in the structural aspects. So, you can say that in English, standard English speakers do not use R after vowels, which is a phonological phenomena. You can say multiple negation in non-standard English is frequent among lower class people. So, this is common for, if you are familiar with the AAVE variants, African American Vernacular English, which is spoken widely in USA. So, you can say it, ain't, no cat, can't get in no coop. So, it means there is not any cat that can get into a pigeon coop. So, you are using multiple negatives, which is a problem with the so called standard Englishes, but it is not a problem for AAVE. At this point, I will introduce you with this idea of social stratification, which is super important, and we will also refer to social stratification later, because this is a major idea in sociolinguistics as a whole. So, if you are coming from a social sciences background, then you know that social stratification is important for different domains of social science, right. So, it was different in, you can say that social stratification was different in feudal system, maybe there was a small ruling class on top and then landed farmers, etc. And you can also say that in Indian context, India has a highly stratified caste society, which has been mentioned by people like Gumperz and Bright. I have deliberately not given you the entire reference. If you want, you can go through the key references and find about them. And with the increase of social mobility, differences among social stratification were equalized. So, what does it mean? It means that earlier the stratification was different, but now the nature of stratification changed due to certain reasons. What are the reasons? Social mobility is one reason, and also due to social mobility there was an emergence of a middle class worldwide. And when we are talking about social stratification, we must say that class constitute another social stratification. So, also factors like education, professional accomplishment, immigrant status have certain roles to play here when we talk about the stratification. And instead of class, we employ the idea of social deprivation and social mobility nowadays, which is important for our purpose. So, we cannot classify the recent situation or contemporary situation with the help of the idea of social class only. We need something else. So, we need the ideas of social deprivation and social mobility, which is important for contemporary analysis. And at this point, I must tell you that dialect and social class are both fuzzy concepts. You can say that, you can't say that one dialect ends here and another dialect begins here, and you cannot say that this particular point is a demarcation for social class A and social class B. So, distribution of the standard and dialectal forms has a relationship with social stratification. This is something that we should remember always. So, whenever we are talking about the distribution of standard and dialects, it is not random. I mean, at times you can say that it is complex, but it is not random. You can actually find certain patterns. So, these patterns are related to the social stratification. There are independent and dependent social variables that Chambers mentioned, and you can basically read on your own about them. We will not talk in detail about the variables, but let me tell you that social variables are independent. So, choice of variant speech forms depend on social factors like age, sex, class, ethnicity, etc., and of course, the setting of formality. We already talked about it. So, how you select a variant form, it depends on the age of a participant, the sex or gender of a participant, the social class, ethnicity, etc., along with the factors that we have mentioned earlier. This is a Trudgill's triangle, which was introduced by Trudgill in 1984. So, here we are basically including the ideas of both social variation and regional variation in this triangle. So, you can see that the social variation the arrow is indicating the social variation, where the highest class is RP, the received pronunciation, and for regional variation you have differences as well, and you have to take both into account. So, the triangle basically relates two continua. You can say that horizontal base is the unbroken chain of regional dialects. I am sure you understand why I am using the term unbroken, because I have already introduced this idea of continuum, and vertical axis shows social stratification with the highest class on top, the RP. This situation, the model was created on the basis of 20th century England, and I am asking you to think about the use of such a model in the case of your language. If you are coming from India, then the Indian context. Can you comment on the regional variation and social stratification in the societies around you? This will be a challenging task, and we need different methods to find about all the details around us, but if you can talk about a basic some basic ideas related to the varieties around you. So, we can say that some dialects enjoy prestige, while some are denied recognition. This is very important. Some dialects enjoy prestige, you can stop me and say, wait, this is not a dialect. If it has prestige, then it must be a language. And some are denied recognition. You can also say that denied recognition means it is something related to a non-standard variety which is spoken by lower class people, if we adopt such an analysis. You can say in industrialized urban societies, the horizontal geographical dialect differentiation has been reinterpreted as being ordered along a vertical axis of social stratification. This is very important for us. So, we are coming to the conclusion part of today's lecture. So, what we did today is we tried to talk about the idea that a language is an assemblage of dialects. So, there are one language can have several dialects under the same umbrella. There are changes in the traditional definition of dialects as opposed to standard languages. We cannot say that size and mutual intelligibility are the determinant factors for classifying languages and dialects. We also learnt about two very important ideas. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. A language is a dialect with written norms. Then we said that accommodation, the idea of accommodation for social adjustment can be either upward or downward. And there are regionals and social variations when we talk about dialects, and social stratification plays a major role in deciding the nature of dialects. So, I hope you remember all this. Here are the key references. Thank you.